What's good, everybody? Welcome to Big Nate's Reading Club. We got our first official stream. We are going to be talking about the titular essay from this collection by David Foster Wallace, Consider the Lobster. So as I'm letting people funnel in here, I could just give a little bit of the premise. My thoughts of this was just that I thought it'd be a fun idea because like we've talked about doing like a video call or some book club related thing, and I thought like Twitch would be a great way to do that, whereas like we can go through the essay almost like if anyone happens to have seen my other podcast, it's gonna be like that, but we're gonna have the chat going. We're gonna have the and we're gonna do some literary analysis. So let me just make sure first of all that I am. Oh hell no! Hold up. Okay, all right, we're chilling. Okay, so I'll just give it a couple minutes for people to funnel in. Chat if you're there, let us know. But yeah, so I'm hyped to talk about this. I figured as an icebreaker. Hey yo, hello. Let me dismiss this. Hello. We got a dope ass discussion today. So we're going to be talking about the Consider Lobster. Like I said, as people are funneling in, I thought it'd be a good way. We can kind of, get to ice break here with what we are reading. So if anyone, whoever's in the chat, let us know what you are reading right now. And as people come in, I was just going to talk about some of the books that I've been reading. So this one I just finished this morning. Okay, you guys can hear me too, presumably. Let me know if you can't. I got a new setup. I got the camera and the fancy mic. But so I just finished Pedro Páramo. Okay, nice, good to hear. Pedro Páramo by Juan Rulfo. And I've seen this one floated around. I honestly forget how it came up on my desk, but I do know that it was supposed to be surreal, and also I knew that it was like related to Blood Meridian vibes, which is very true. The prose is very austere, and it's just got this similar kind of like landscape, and just the way it's written, it is similar to Blood Meridian. I thought the writing was fantastic. That's the thing. I was singing this book's high praise. I'm like, this could be all the way to the top, one of my top favorite books, just from the writing in the beginning. But the thing was, it's kind of like the low-key was not an actual story. It's like this person goes to like an old village that's kind of apparently deserted. It's not clear though, because it's like the person that he has somebody who walks him there, right? Abundio, shout out Abundio. And but then as we go, it's, he said, so you're going here? Oh, everybody's dead. And he goes there and there's nobody, but then like these weird things start happening with like spirits and ghosts, and it turns out Abundio is dead too. That's not a spoiler. That's like part of the you find that out immediately. But but anyway, it ends up just kind of being like this series where we get to see all the people that were living in the town at that time, etc., etc. But the writing was super good, and this was definitely worth the read. I just wish there was a bit more of like a story with like characters, you know what I'm saying? So, but that was good to knock up out the list. And then up next, so this one was short, as you can tell, real quickie. The opposite of that is what I've been reading lately. The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Oh, can you guys like see the chat? It kind of looks like small, huh? Hold up, let me... Oh, that's a little better. Yeah, that's better. I think I had it overlaid. Okay. Oh wait, hold up. Okay. Oh shit! I think I just pinned. Hold up. I'm still figuring this out. I'm still. I did not mean to pin that. Unpin after. Man, why would it even? 20 seconds. Okay. Well, whatever. Anyhow. Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. This has been quite a whirlwind. I mean, I'm not even halfway through it. I'm like 500 pages in, but it is crazy. The thing with this book that's interesting is that apparently the Third Reich is one of the most like well documented sort of like totalitarian regime, and obviously it has all that World War II historical significance. I mean, they started World War II, these mofos, and you watch them as you go all the way up to. In fact, bro's about to do that. He's about to invade Poland, which, spoiler alert, that's gonna have consequences. So itching to read. Yeah, I know, with the history books I agree completely. Like, I actually bought this book. I've heard it's like a good one, and then once Elon Musk did that little Nazi salute, I'm like, you know what, there's been a few things that have been leading towards me like, let's pick this up. I was in the mood for a long read, and I agree, the history books are fire. I don't know what to read next, but because that's like not my space. But if anyone has recommendations, your boy would love to hear them. I was thinking, at the very least, I want to read Herodotus, because he's like the OG father of history, and I'm actually taking a class right now, history of mathematics, and Herodotus is brought up even there. So yeah, if anyone's got good history recommendations, y'all already know what to do. Okay, real quick, I'm brewing some tea. Let me give you guys the visual. Oh, you read Herodotus in college? Okay, nice. I've seen some clips, that is to say excerpts. I've read some excerpts of Herodotus. But yeah, I got the tea brewing. Let's wait for that and then we gonna get started. But I hear, I mean, and from what I've read too, he kind of just like, it's almost like individual narratives and stories of people, and it's just like this huge survey of, and also he's traveling the world and gets sort of their perspectives. Yeah, he gets a lot of his stories from old aristocrats. Okay, some of it's wildly capped. Yeah, I believe that. So, yeah, and like I mentioned in one of my other videos, I was reading The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich with War and Peace. So the history theme has been coming, and I'm like, you know what? I'm down. Because the thing with history is it really has like that pace and drama of like an actual narrative, but then it's just crazy, of course, because all of it's real. But like this, this Hitler and the Rise and Fall of Third Reich, it is a full ass political drama. So yeah, that's been a good time. So okay, let me take my little sip. Let me know in the chat what you guys are reading too. Just curious. But okay, it is officially 6:06. I think everything is working. Like, I send out my little announcement, so I think I've done everything there. If I fucked up, someone let me know. But why don't we just get right to it? And then I think chat looks good. Let me know otherwise if it's like hard to see. But we gonna get right into the essay. Consider the lobster. Okay, hold on. How can I unpin this? I swear. It's just gonna, okay, whoever I pinned, sorry, I did not. Oh, Song of Solomon. Yeah, I got my boy right there somewhere. I thought that book was fantastic. That was my favorite Toni Morrison I've read so far. Yeah, very good. The writing, super poetic and beautiful, but in a way that's actually, like, I felt like Beloved was a little, it's also very poetic and lyrical, but at times it could kind of like venture on a little too, like, okay, I don't exactly, this kind of just like sounds good almost. But Song of Solomon is deeply like, lyrical, poetic, but it's got everything. It's actually like fire. So, okay, first Morrison. All right, well, you are blessed. So I'm gonna take one more sip and then we finna get right into it. All right, and this is my first time doing a real stream, so y'all gotta cut me a little bit of slack here as well. Okay, there we go. Thank God. Okay, sorry, I had to get, the pin was like blocking my chat. Okay, all right. So currently, Crime and Punishment and Jung and spirituality. Yeah. Oh, that's a great combo right there. Crime and Punishment and Jung. That's just those are wonderful. I've read Crime and Punishment like 3 times actually, and honestly, it's a book I would love to revisit again. It's a little rough around the edges, Crime and Punishment's raw. But the themes and the ideas and like the passages there, some of the all-time greats. Yeah, and then Jung is just my fucking goat. Everybody, I fuck with Jung. Anything he writes, at least that I've read, is just straight fire. So, yeah, exactly. You can tell that it's written serially. It's funny how many novels are actually like that. What's it called? Charles Dickens' ass. I think a lot of Charles Dickens was serialized, but Tale of Two Cities. I know that you can tell bro got paid by the penny. And I feel like there was a stopping point, and then they're like, actually, bro got to run up his bag a little more. So he kept writing, but hey, it works for me. But all right, everybody, we are going to get into Consider the Lobster. So whether or not you have read this, we are going to go through all the major passages and talk about it. So if you've read it, that is great. If you haven't, then you're going to be hearing it first. It's going to be a bit of like a semi-reading / discussion of it. So a little bit of background. Oh, okay, nice. Jung, spirituality, David Tracy. Okay, so it's a book about Jung. Good. That you get the overall picture, and then you can get to the primary source. All right, so my understanding, just by way of background, is that David Foster Wallace was commissioned by a food magazine, Gourmet, to essentially go out and visit this event that was taking place called the Maine Lobster Festival. And they'd heard about it from some other, I think, famous food critic, and they were just raving, oh my God, this festival was amazing, it was fantastic. So, like, we're going to send our boy and have him basically report on it. And we're going to get into a ton of stuff like with relation to like the gonzo journalism, the idea that David Foster Wallace weaves in a lot of his own personal experiences and thoughts and whimsies, as we shall definitely see in this essay, but also his personal experience, getting picked up from the airport, describing the actual place. And I think that would be a good spot to start is. So he goes to this place and he's describing just the, like, literally just the descriptives of it. Like, what does it look like? What's happening? And this is, I think, where we get to find out some of the, like, early introduction to David Foster Wallace's maximalist writing style. So he's describing it, and it's this very long sentence and list, but he's talking about how his concerts, there's the annual Main Sea Goddess Beauty Pageant, there's Saturday's Big Parade, there's Memorial Crate Race, the annual amateur cooking competition, carnival rides, midway attractions, food booths, the MLF's main eating tent, right? So he's got this huge list of everything that's going on. He says there's lobster rolls, lobster turnovers, sauté, lobster salad, bisque, ravioli, deep fried lobster dumplings, right? So he's just really painting the picture, and just, you know, this whole passage, if you've read it, is just like one huge torrential outpour of, it's almost like, you know, excessive descriptions, but it does do a really good job of, I think, just capturing, I mean, setting the stage for what's going to be like the overwhelming nature of this festival, which David Foster Wallace will have some words to talk about. But again, he's just, you know, setting the scene here, and I think this first part here is where we get a little intro into the gonzo journalism stuff. So he's describing all of this, and he says, your assigned correspondent saw it all, accompanied by one girlfriend and both his parents, one of which parents was actually born and raised in Maine, albeit in the extreme northern inland part, which is potato country and a world away from the touristic midcoast. So just, again, we're seeing these long, fragmented, run-on-y kind of sentences. But, you know, he's basically like, you know, I went with my girl and I went with my parents. And, you know, so he's good. Like, we're leading into this, right? And this already, I think, is one of the first departures from what you would think of a conventional, you know, food magazine, gourmet magazine reporting on the event. So he says, you know, for practical purposes, everyone knows what a lobster is. As usual, though, there's much more to know than much of us care about. And so he goes into like this deep dive into like the actual, like almost like an encyclopedic knowledge of the lobster. So he says, taxonomically speaking, a lobster is a marine crustacean of the family Homoridae, with I probably pronounced that wrong, characterized by 5 pairs of jointed legs, the first pair terminating in large pincerish claws. They have stalked eyes, gills on their legs, and antennae. And, you know, again, just this maximalist, like laying it on heavy, like all these different etymological, encyclopedic knowledge of the lobster. So he's like, you know, and of course the essay, consider the lobster, and he's already doing the David Foster Wallace thing of just cutting straight to the root of, you know, like what it is that he's actually reporting on. So, okay. And then he points out that the name lobster actually comes from the Old English lopestre, which is thought to be a corrupt form of the Latin word for locust, which is combined with the Old English lop, which meant spider. And so he's talking about how the lobster is a crustacean, or just a crustacean, is an aquatic arthropod of the class Crustacea. Which, again, I'm sorry, I have to point out, like, all of this in a, you know, classic, like, gourmet magazine article, this whole tangent about just, you know, what is a lobster, it's already doing something very interesting, I think. But he says they belong to the class Crustacea, which include crabs, shrimps, barnacles, lobsters, crayfish, and these arthropods are members of the phylum Arthropoda, which covers insects, spiders, crustaceans, centipedes, and millipedes. And the reason I'm going through all this is because, as David Foster Wallace points out, the point is that lobsters are basically giant sea insects. He says they date back from the Jurassic period, biologically so much older than mammalia that they might as well be from another planet. And he points out that they are the garbage men of the sea, eaters of dead stuff. So, okay, I'm going to just check that. I see a little comment here. Later discussion of interest and of us trying to imagine the experience of lobsters. In the first page, he mentions the bay being the nerve stem, right? Oh, okay, and the traffic being imaginably unimaginable. It was only my second read where I realized he was foreshadowing the discussion of imagining the lobster's pain. Yeah, that's really interesting. I love the idea, the description of, you know, the nerve stem, because he has this whole, like, this essay is surprisingly biological, which, again, we shall talk about. But yeah, I love the, you know, the language here, imaginably unimaginable. That is that first little taste of basically the metaphysical question of, like, we can never understand what it's like to, I mean, be another person, let alone another animal. So yeah, I hadn't even picked up on that. That's really interesting. But like I say, so he points out that lobsters are basically giant sea insects. And the way, like, I had heard about that like a long time ago, or maybe it was when I first read this essay. But it is interesting because once you point it out like that, it is like, yeah, they actually very much fit the, like, characterization of an insect. And as he points out, up until, because we consider them to be nowadays, high class eating. Lobster is one of the most expensive things on the menu. But up until sometime in the 1800s, though, lobster was literally low class food, eaten only by the poor and institutionalized. Some colonies even had laws against feeding lobsters to inmates more than once a week because it was thought to be cruel and unusual, like making people eat rats. So, and he also talks about how, in the olden days, they were super abundant, like you could just walk out to the water and it was like, crawling with them, which again very much evokes that image of lobsters as insects. But then he says, now of course lobster is posh, a delicacy, only a step or two down from caviar. He says lobster is now the seafood analog to steak, with which it's so often twinned as surf and turf on the really expensive part of the chain steakhouse menu. So he just points out that lobsters are actually, nowadays they're considered posh. They're considered like a luxury food up there with steak. Whereas back then it was considered to be the equivalent of eating rats. And as he said, there were laws against it. So already, again, interesting stuff here with just the cultural conception of, lobsters as food. Yeah, his writing is funny in the beginning, and especially when we get to the main eating tent part, I think, which is coming up here. But I did want to, this reminded me of a study that I learned a long time ago in a cognitive neuroscience class, where basically they had a $5 bottle of wine, right? And they put people in the fMRI, and they told people, one group of people, they were told it was $70, $80 wine. Another group of people, they were told, it was the actual price, $5 wine. So, as you might expect, people reported the $80, when it's reported as $80, they said that one tasted, significantly better than other people who, when they're told it was just the $5 wine, than what they would rate it. So there was a difference in how people perceived the reported behavior of how good the wine tasted. But the cool part about the fMRI thing was that they actually found that the region of the brain, and I'm speaking very generally here, but the region of the brain that's related to basically gustatory pleasure, whether or not something tastes good, it was more active in the group where they were told it was $80 relative to the people that was $5. So anyway, that was a little tangent, but this idea, that the cultural perspective can really change, not only just, internally, psychologically, but even at the neurological level. Which is relevant because we've been talking about the neuroscience, or we will at least be talking about a little bit of neuroscience-y stuff here with the lobster. But so I thought that was interesting. Back in the day, lobster was considered this shitty rat food, basically, and then now it's one of the most expensive things you can get on the menu. So he does a little bit more reflection, and then he talks about, being at this actual place and talking about the arriving at the main eating tent. And so I'm just going to read this whole passage, I think, because again, we're getting a look into David Foster Wallace's maximalist style, and he just paints, I think, it's a good but also horrible picture of what this place is actually like. So he's describing the main eating tent, for which there is a constant Disneyland-grade queue, and which turns out to be a square quarter-mile of awning-shaded cafeteria lines in rows of long institutional tables at which friend and stranger alike sit cheek by jowl, cracking and chewing and dribbling. Love that word. He said dribbling. It's hot, and the sagged roof traps the steams and the smells, which latter are strong and only partly food-related. It is also loud, and a good percentage of the total noise is masticatory. So that's the first part. And he's describing, this tent that's, he says, a quarter square mile long, and it's just rows of institutionalized tables. And I thought this way of framing it was so good that hold on, let me find it. The sagged roof traps the steam and the smells. So already just it's hot, it's humid, it's nasty. Which latter are strong and only partly food related. So it's just that image alone, and also a ton of noise. A good percentage of it is masticatory, just these mofos. And he says you're sitting cheek and jowl next to these people. It sounds like a horrible time. And going on, so same part here. He says the suppers come in styrofoam trays, and the soft drinks are iceless and flat, and the coffee is convenience store coffee and more styrofoam, and the utensils are plastic. Nor do they give you near enough napkins, considering how messy lobster is to eat, especially when you're squeezed onto benches alongside children of various ages and vastly different levels of fine motor development. So that's kind of like good hat what you were saying, like the humor. It's like these children with varying levels of fine motor development. Not to mention the people who have somehow smuggled in their own beer in enormous aisle-blocking coolers, or who all of a sudden produce their own plastic tablecloths and spread them over large portions of table to try to reserve them for their own little groups. So, I don't know about you guys, but this sounded like a true hellscape. Like, it's hot, it's sweaty, there's just mofos just chowing down on lobster, people blocking the aisles with their coolers, children of various fine motor development running around. This sounds terrible. And on top of the fact that he's there with his girlfriend and his parents. But again, so he's, this is the gonzo journalism part, right? He's weaving in and out the actual description and experience of going to this place, but also these other sort of like extracurricular or like extra textual or like the extra eventual, you understand what I'm saying, aspects of like, what is the background of the lobster? What's like the historical context in which they've been compared to now, right? Lobster ain't that good. I honestly I had a lobster roll in Boston once because Boston's supposed to be super like, like seafood lobster. Yeah, I thought it was very mid, actually. I thought it was very mid. So again, just goes to show how much like that little cultural perception of it has to do with it. So hold up, sip break. You already know how it goes. And so he's describing just, lobster's good. I like it. Except, yeah, okay. Maybe I've just had the wrong lobster, but I wasn't a fan. It was, but maybe the roll too wasn't the best method for it. And then he's just continuing to describe this, and I think this is part of it, just how kind of horrible festivals are in general too. He's like, you have to spend $20 extra for a folding chair to, watch the headliner shows. The North Tent has this mad scramble for NyQuil cup-sized samples of finalists' entries. Or the much-touted Maine Sea Goddess pageant finals, I love this too, which turns out to be excruciatingly long and to consist mainly of endless thanks of tributes to local sponsors. I've been at the symphony sometimes, and these mofos we would like to thank so-and-so, clap. I'm not clapping. I refuse to clap for a fucking sponsor. But so I mean, it wasn't that bad, but the way he's saying it's an endless thanks and tributes to local sponsors, grossly inadequate porta potty facilities, nowhere to wash your hands before or after eating. This just sounds terrible. And as he says, basically he's talking about the nature of these events. In short, it's not for everyone. And then hold up, just looking. He's always amazing at the medicinal. Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. I agree. So he says it's not for everyone, and this is where we get a footnote number 6, which I will. Okay, so these aren't all my annotations, by the way. I got this used, but the point is, this whole thing right here is one footnote, and this is very characteristic of David Foster Wallace's style, where he'll just go on these whole ass huge tangents, all in a footnote. For David Foster Wallace, footnote is canon. But again, he said it's not for everyone, and so let's go down this rabbit hole of a footnote. And so, he's leading up to it, and he says, basically talking about this nature of like, essentially like almost like the philosophy of tourism. He says, I confess that I have never understood why so many people's idea of a fun vacation is to don flip-flops and sunglasses and crawl through maddening traffic to loud, hot, crowded tourist venues in order to sample a local flavor that is by definition ruined by the presence of tourists. And so he keeps going, and then again, just like almost like that meta level stuff. He says, but since this footnote will almost surely not survive magazine editing anyway, here it goes. And he goes on this whole thing, and he talks about why he is not a big fan of like this, I guess, tourism, hyper-capitalist tourist culture. He says, my personal experience has not been that traveling around the country is broadening or relaxing, or that radical changes in place and context have a salutary effect, but rather that intranational tourism is radically constricting and humbling in the hardest way, hostile to my fantasy of being a true individual, of living somehow outside and above it all. All of this still in a footnote. To be a mass tourist for me is to become a pure late-date American, alien, ignorant, greedy for something you cannot ever have, disappointed in a way that you can never admit. It is to spoil by fucking hell. It is to spoil by way of sheer ontology the very unspoiledness you are there to experience. It is to impose yourself on places that in all non-economic ways would be better, realer without you. It is, in lines and gridlocks and transaction after transaction, to confront a dimension of yourself that is as inescapable as it is painful. As a tourist, you become economically significant, but existentially loathsome, an insect on a dead thing. So just wow, what a whirlwind of a footnote, right? But he's talking about like just this critique of tourism where like you're almost like a voyeur, you're going to try and like experience the actual place and culture itself, but as he says, it's basically ontologically necessary that it's the exact opposite of what's happening. You become economically significant but existentially loathsome, an insect on a dead thing. I said, shit, all right, fine, I won't go on vacations anymore. But so, and then you like go back up. It's like, okay, where were we? Because we're on footnote number 6. So hold up, tea break. I've been talking. And then we can just move on. So we're starting to heat up here, right? We're getting into like that classic DFW style. We getting deep into the footnotes. We've already done some interesting reflection that's very unconventional in terms of like how a normal magazine article like this would go. And yeah, I agree. The tourism analysis. I mean, if you go to somewhere like Disneyland or like you're in New York and you're just at like the most touristy spot, the whole thing does feel kind of like a sham. It just feels kind of, as he says, existentially icky. It's just very consumerist, right? You're there to just, everything costs money, like he's saying. It costs $20 to get a fucking folding chair, to watch people list off sponsors. It's all just money, money, money. It's this huge engine. And he even says, too, we feel disappointed in a way that we do not want to, that we can never admit. Because, when you go on vacation, there's almost like this expectation that you're going, you're having fun, this, that, and the other. You start checking off all the different touristy boxes, but like, and half the time it's not actually fun. If you just do like straight tourist shit and you're waiting in line, that shit is ass. But, it's that kind of thing that you don't want to admit to yourself. So yeah, Disney and hyper reality, exactly. I mean, he even describes the lines in the main eating tent as Disneyland grade Q. So okay, yeah. So and again, I just love this little description. He's finishing off that paragraph that in the middle of the footnotes caught us in. He said, crowds of people slapping canal zone mosquitoes as they eat deep fried Twinkies and watch Professor Paddywhack on 6-foot stilts with plastic lobsters protruding from all directions. So that's very American. That's also, I think, capturing like that hyper touristy consumerist. He even describes it basically. This whole thing is a glorified fair. Because, that's like some fair shit. Deep fried Twinkies. It's hot. You got mosquitoes. Sounds like, I mean, also just from what I have gathered of David Foster Wallace's personality, he seems rather introverted. So this whole thing sounds like, I would hate this, let alone someone like him. And so, he says lobster is essentially a summer food. This is because we now prefer our lobsters fresh, which means they have to be recently caught. And okay, now we're starting to heat up. Because he talks about, and he's leading up. He says lobster can be baked, broiled, steamed, grilled, sautéed, stir-fried, microwaved, more maximalism, right? The most common method, though, is boiling, and you typically do this at home. So now we're starting to get into like what I think is going to be the major, like the main ideas of this essay. And so, you read the recipes, right? You get the water boiling, you put the lobsters in one at a time, you cover the kettle, you bring it up back to a boil, right? Very matter of fact, he's describing in terms of like, the recipes all say to do this, that, and the other. And then he has this paragraph. He says, a detail so obvious that most recipes don't even bother to mention it is that each lobster is supposed to be alive when you put it in the kettle. This is part of lobster's modern appeal. It is the freshest food that there is. And so it's like, okay, the thing that people, the unwritten thing is like, yeah, of course you boil the lobster alive. And, if you've read this essay, David Foster Wallace is going to do a serious, philosophical penetration of that idea. But, he says, you get them, oftentimes he's describing like the appeal being that they're so fresh. And I think many of us have had this experience too, where you go into some kind of restaurant and they have these tanks and it's filled with lobsters. And they're, he describes it. He says, the animal's claws are pegged or banded to keep them from tearing one another apart under the stress of captivity. And they survive right up until they're boiled. So we've all had that experience where we see, that they're rubber. I've seen it where they're like rubber banded and they're just kind of like going about doing their thing. Let me see. So in the chat, I was looking up why boil alive, and I could be wrong, but part of it is that lobster meat deteriorates very fast after dying. Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense because, again, he's saying that the appeal is that it's so fresh. It's like literally, there's not even they die and then they're cooked. It's like they die as they are being cooked. It doesn't get any more fresh than that. And like you said, if it deteriorates quickly, all the more reason to do it. So we get, again, another fun little footnote here. So he's talking about how you basically band the lobster claws together. And he says, this is similar reasoning that underlies the practice of what's termed debeaking with broiler chicken and brood hens. For maximum commercial efficiency, it requires that enormous poultry populations be confined in unnaturally close quarters, under which conditions many birds go crazy and peck one another to death. And as this happens, he says, when they're debeaked, the chickens receive no anesthetic. And it's not clear to me whether most gourmet readers know about debeaking or related practices like dehorning cattle in commercial feedlots, cropping swine's tail in factory hog farms to keep psychotically bored neighbors from chewing them off, and so forth. It so happens that your assigned correspondent knew almost nothing about standard meat industry operations before starting work on this article. And I think there's a few interesting things going on there. One, just the fact that we have a philosophically actually super interesting idea just thrown in a footnote, a whole ass, it's a huge ass footnote, but the idea that all of this would be in a footnote is really interesting. And then he talks about like this debeaking. It's like, okay, now we're starting to lead into like, okay, the idea that we kill lobster as they like we boil them alive, but also making that into the larger connection of just factory farm. How do we get any of our food? And with chickens, they get debeaked. With cows, they get dehorned. With pigs, they get detailed. And what's fascinating about this too is he's starting to play around with like these meta level elements. I think I would call them postmodern as well, where he says, it's not clear to me whether most gourmet readers know about debeaking. So he's addressing the readers of the article directly and then talking about his own experience with this whole thing. He said, I, for one, essentially, I have never heard of it until I started doing this article. And I think this, as we shall see, this essay is very much like a working text with David Foster Wallace's own development of ideas, because he at several points in this essay he brings up things that he admits he's like, I had not even given this a thought before that actually happened. And yes, good hat, the meat industry is crazy. He will talk about it again shortly and give some comparisons. And so then he starts kind of revisiting things. He describes the world's largest lobster cooker at the Maine Lobster Festival and how it can process over 100 lobsters at a time for the maid eating tent. And in light of what he just said with, being boiled alive and bringing up this question, it's like, that's actually kind of fucking insane, boiling 100 lobsters alive. And he'll make an analogy that I think is really good later. But then he poses the question flat out, right? Is it all right to boil a sentient creature alive for our gustatory pleasure? And then he kind of starts to elaborate on this idea, and he starts talking about the presence of PETA. I forget exactly what PETA stands for, but the animal rights group, and how they have like this whole dynamic between the Maine Lobster Festival and PETA. And there's tons of good stuff here too about like we get this footnote, I believe, where he's talking about like getting picked up from the airport and all this other stuff. And he's talking to the dude that picked him up, in fact, Dick. And when asked about this question, he explains what he and his family, the question of lobsters and boiling them alive and everything, explains what he and his family feel is the crucial mitigating factor in the whole morality of boiling lobsters alive issue. They say, there's a part of the brain in people and animals that lets us feel pain, and lobsters' brains don't have that part. So that's kind of like, that's like the lay person, you just ask random cab driver in this festival, what do you guys think about it? And they're like, oh, they don't have that part of the brain. And as David Foster Wallace points out, this is incorrect in about 9 different ways. And He goes on to explain, for instance, that the pain receptors that are known to be part of a much older and more primitive system of nociceptors and prostalgins that are managed by the brain system and thalamus. So basically, there are pain receptors called nociceptors. And again, I learned about those in my neuroscience class. And as David Foster Wallace points out, they have these nociceptors. So it's like, okay, there's the brain cell, or like the nervous system cells that process pain. They have pain. And so like, therefore, well, for one, these people are wrong who say, lobsters' brains don't have that part. They actually do. And, and then he explains too that this is one of the oldest sort of, pain and nociception and like things like that. This is one of the oldest mechanisms that we have. He's like in the animal kingdom and just in our evolution. He says the common experience of accidentally touching a hot stove and yanking your hand back before you're even aware that anything's going on is explained by the fact that many of the processes by which we detect and avoid painful stimuli do not involve the cortex. So it's the idea too that all the important neurochemical action takes place in the spine. So all of that is to say that the idea of pain, and this makes sense just from an evolutionary perspective, but on the question of whether can lobsters feel pain or not, this is a mechanism that goes way, way back. And in like with our own, and he gives that example, right? When you've touched something hot and you've drawn your hand back before you even realized it was hot, that's because, and once again, it's kind of fun to see this, but in my neuroscience classes, you learn that there are in fact neural circuits within the spine, because if if you're touching something hot, that signal's got to go all the way to the brain, got to go all the way back to the hand, and then you pull it out. So there's literally circuits within the spine, so it happens more localized and easy. The point being in all of that this is a very, very old mechanism evolutionarily. And there's no reason to think that, lobsters wouldn't be able to feel pain. And then kind of alluding to what, I forget who said it in the chat earlier, but that foreshadowing with the imaginably unimaginable, or however he phrased it. He talks about, pain is a totally subjective and mental experience, and we do not have direct access to anyone or anything's pain but our own. So he also acknowledges that to even answer this question, he's addressing right off the bat, this involves hardcore philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, value theory, ethics, right? And also, it's interesting just him setting that up for what we're about to talk about. But remember, we're in a gourmet food magazine article, right? This is some shit, you're at the doctor's office, they got a little food magazine, you open it, and bro's talking about metaphysics, epistemology, biology of lobsters. This essay is just all over the place, and it's got so much that is philosophically interesting about it. And then he talks about, and just acknowledging that this question's hard, right? It gets progressively more abstract and convolved as we move further and further out from the higher type mammals into cattle and swine and dogs, cats, rodents, and then birds and fish, finally invertebrates like lobsters. So there is this kind of like hierarchy almost. Like with humans, yes, and things like dogs and also particularly things like cattle and stuff like that, they're a little closer to us in terms of like, mammalian animals and evolutionary. Then we get down to like the lobsters. So there's this whole hierarchy and possible space of conscious experience, and that's what he's sort of referencing now. And he says, the most important point here, though, is that the whole animal cruelty and eating issue is not just complex, it's also uncomfortable. It is, at any rate, uncomfortable for me. As far as I can tell, my own main way of dealing with this conflict has been to avoid thinking about the whole unpleasant thing. I should add that it appears to me unlikely that many readers of Gourmet wish to think about it either, or to be queried about the morality of their eating habits in the pages of a culinary monthly. So again, couple interesting things going on here. He's pointing out his own experience when writing like this. It's like, in thinking about this lobster and them being boiled alive and stuff, he's realizing that just writing about this, thinking about this, it's very uncomfortable for him. And as far as he can tell, his whole philosophy on it has just been not to think about it at all. And then again, addressing the Gourmet readers, he's like, I understand that's probably not what you wish to think about either, or to be queried about the morality of eating habits in the pages of a culinary monthly. So again, tons of really interesting stuff he's doing in terms of like the narrative aspect, the journalistic aspect, and of course the philosophical material that he's getting into. So Good Hat says, I appreciate that he outlines why it's neurologically confusing and unclear if lobsters experience pain in any way that we do then, and on top of that points out that the surrounding philosophical problems of understanding lobsters' pain makes it way more complex on top of that. I agree, because it goes both ways. You know, there is a version, and I think a lot of people would subscribe to this, that like, you know, a lobster is basically just like a glorified worm, and yeah, maybe they have like nociceptors and things like that, but you know, we can't automatically say like, yes, they feel pain. I mean, that's something that is, you know, he'll talk about that and gives what he thinks the evidence kind of points towards. But, you know, at a fundamental philosophical epistemic level, we can never know. And it's tricky, and the brain hardware of a lobster, let alone any other animal, is so, I mean, he even describes it right earlier. He says these animals come from the Jurassic period, and they might as well be aliens to us. So that gap between, you know, doing a neuroscientific understanding of what's happening in the biology, it's tricky, it's complex, right? A lot of people flatten this sort of question to, yeah, right, exactly. So yep. Okay, let me just gather my stuff here. Oh, yeah. Okay, so he gives the example basically, you know, imagine if, for instance, making the comparison how there's the huge lobster boiling pin where you can put, you know, 100 lobsters in at once. He says, try to imagine a Nebraska beef festival at which part of the festivities is watching trucks pull up and the live cattle get driven down the ramp and slaughtered right there on the world's largest killing floor. There's no way that would happen, basically, is what he says. And that is a really good analogy, right? Because he talks about, you know, the boat, part of the allure and the fun of this festival is the boats literally come in, they dock, and they get shelled out by like the hundreds into this giant boiling lobster pit. And if you don't give much thought, okay, yeah, lobsters, whatever, they get cooked, they can't feel pain, whatever, then you don't think much of it. But if you're starting to, as David Foster Wallace is sort of forcing you to do in this essay, think about it in terms of, you know, lobsters might actually have some kind of sentience. And to make that analogy, he makes it with imagine we had cows and we brought them and you just like fucking slaughtered them right there on the spot. That would be horrific, right? That would be horrible. And yet, is it really so different than with the lobsters? Of course, there's arguments for, you know, both sides of that, but it's just he's starting to give us that sort of perspective. And then, okay, well, first off, tea break. But already, you know, tons of interesting stuff happening in this essay. So, okay. So then he talks about basically the experience of anybody who has tried to cook a lobster at home. And what happens, you get it, right? You get it in a bag or whatever. You bring your kettle to a boil. You do all that matter-of-fact stuff. And then, as he says, once you put it in, whereupon some uncomfortable things start to happen. However stuporous a lobster is from the trip home, for instance, it tends to come alarmingly to life when placed in boiling water. If you're tilting it from a container into the steaming kettle, the lobster will sometimes try to cling to the container sides or even to hook its claws over the kettle's rim, like a person trying to keep from going over the edge of a roof. And worse is when the lobster is fully immersed. Even if you cover the kettle and turn away, you can usually hear the cover rattling and clanking as the lobster tries to push off, or the creature's claws scraping the sides of the kettle as it thrashes around. The lobster, in other words, behaves very much as you or I would behave if we were plunged into boiling water. A blunter way to say this is that the lobster acts as if it's in terrible pain, causing some cooks to leave the kitchen altogether and basically take one of those timers and come back once it's all done. So yeah, that was a lot right there that we just talked about, but he's describing that process. I've never cooked a lobster at home. I don't know about you guys. But this is where his, you know, narrative, like descriptive aspect is so good, because he's talking about like the lobster like pathetically trying to cling to the, you know, it clearly does not want to go in, and you put it in the water for whatever you think about its neurology or its biology. This thing, you put it in, it's chilling, it's totally lethargic. You throw it in a boiling pot of water, and now all of a sudden this thing is going crazy, trying to like bang the lid off. And all of this points to, obviously, like, the lobster appears to be in pain, right? We talked about the neurology and biology, but this is just, like, the behavioral part. And it's pretty hard to justify, as he says, you know, the fact that anything else is happening besides that this lobster is in pain. So we got someone in the chat. When I was a kid, my parents refused to ever try making lobster for us for this exact reason. Yeah, I mean, I agree. He does something interesting too, where, because I do wonder about this. How much of us, because we would get squeamish, right? When you actually have to kill the lobster, you have to put it in the boiling water. It's just like, yeah, no, I'm good. I'm good on that. But I wonder, to the chatter, if your parents or you or whatever, because I know I do this as well, eat meat, chicken, beef, pork. And if I may, actually, one sec. There was a really great footnote that I just passed over where he said, it is significant to me that lobster, fish, and chicken are culture's words for the animal and the meat, right? Lobster is lobster. Chicken is chicken. Fish is fish. But yet where other mammals, we seem to require euphemisms like beef and pork that help us separate the meat we eat from the living creature, right? So it's like we don't call beef cows, right? We call it beef. We call pork and not pigs. And part of this seems to almost like an unconscious sort of act is that we come up with these euphemisms. We come up with these other words to represent those different things. Okay, I'm vegan, so this essay is sort of preaching to the choir. Okay, good. Well, even aside from that, I think there's a lot of people to whom the act of killing a lobster probably prevents them from eating it, but they would still go on and eat other forms of meat, and that it really does beg the question: how much of this is just because all of that stuff takes place behind closed doors? I mean, I often think about this. Like, if I had to literally slit the chicken's throat and debone it, degut it, clean it, fucking feather it, I would probably be a lot less inclined to eat chicken. So, whereas lobster, I guess because it's so accessible and it's so like plentiful, and you just you throw it in a pot, it's very easy to kind of do. I guess it's more of a household food. But yeah, that question is interesting here. And yeah, good hat, meat eater here. This essay is troubling. I agree. Another thing that David Foster Wallace, you can just imagine this must have shocked the gourmet readers, that read it. It's like, holy shit. But as he points out at the end, isn't part of being a gourmet thinking deeply about the context and nature of the food that gets put onto your plate? So very, very good stuff that he does there. But so he says, he's just describing, at a high level here. There happen to be two main criteria that most ethicists agree on for determining whether a living creature has the capacity to suffer. One is how much of the neurological hardware required for pain experience the animal comes equipped with. Do they have nociceptors, prostalgins, neuronal opioid receptors, etc.? The other criterion is whether the animal demonstrates behavior associated with pain. So basically there's two aspects, right? According to the consensus with ethicists, there is the biological hardware and there's the external behavior. We've already talked about how the lobsters do in fact seem to have what are essentially pain cells, and from what we can tell, they seem to be exhibiting behavior that looks like pain. He says it takes a whole lot of intellectual gymnastics and behaviorist hair splitting not to see struggling, thrashing, and lid clattering as just such pain behavior. And he talks about how it takes about 45 seconds for a lobster to die, and that's just, you imagine them being boiled, just horrible agony for 45 seconds. So okay, just checking the chat. I stopped eating animal products for the first time 4 days ago, actually. Okay, also, what's up, Poopsie Tutor? Good to see you back again. Yeah, my practice with this, I was vegetarian for I've been on and off for few years at least, because precisely for this reason, and like my compromise now is I've been going to places like Whole Foods, like their deli apparently only sources like local humanely raised meat. I mean, it's still like if I had to go to the threshing floor and slit the fucking animal's throat myself, I think that'd have a huge difference. And then, not to mention, we don't even know about the horrors of we do know from what little glimpses we've seen, but of factory farming. It is arguably, he has a point at some point. He's like, will we look back on what we're doing now as like what Nero and like the Roman Colosseum torture fests were? Is that how we will view things like this and factory farming? And yeah, it's difficult to kind of see how it would not be like that. And it's also interesting too, the sort of, as he says, intellectual gymnastics people will do, because I think I at least in my case, like I'm kind of just biting the bullet that like, yeah, we are killing animals to eat them, and again, I try and go for like the humanely sourced stuff, but at the end of the day, it's still probably a lot of suffering going on, right? And this is just something that David Foster Wallace is taking your nose and rubbing it in. So, okay, yeah, I wonder what the reception of the article was, if the readers are anything like the people that go to the Lobster Fest. Yeah, it's a great question. I'd be curious. I'm glad whoever his editor was, because, he has a footnote where he's like, I'm sure this footnote's not making it past the editor. I'm glad the editor let that in. This is such a unique piece of writing for, just like a normal magazine. I'm trying to imagine a gore reader and what they thought about this. Yeah, I agree. I mean, for one, it's just like, wow, what a fantastic essay. But yeah, hitting these gourmet readers with an existential crisis. So, yeah, he goes on to describe just other ways, right? People, again, kind of try and find ways to get out of this aside from just boiling them alive. So, for instance, some cooks will drive a sharp, heavy knife point first into a spot, basically where our third, you basically just blam the mofo, just boom. But the thing is, their nervous system operates off not one, but several ganglia, and disabling only the frontal ganglion, the little headshot, does not normally result in quick death or unconsciousness. So it's like, okay, is that, if it's better, it's only marginally better. And he says sometimes people kind of do what they do is they'll put a lobster in cold water and slowly bring it to a boil, referencing the fact that apparently, I don't know if this is true, which is kind of crazy if it is, but like if you put a frog in water and then slowly bring it to a boil, allegedly they don't try and jump out. They just kind of sit there. But he's like, the thing is, we of course know that the lobster is clearly clanging around trying to get out of that mofo. And if anything, if the water isn't right, they will suffer from slow suffocation on top of that. And he says, whatever the virtues are of these alternate methods, he says what happens is it basically gets evened out because there are even worse and crueler ways people prepare lobster. Time-thrifty cooks, this just sounds horrible too. Time-thrifty cooks sometimes microwave them alive, usually after poking several vent holes in the carapace, which is a precaution most shellfish microwavers learn about the hard way. Live dismemberment, on the other hand, is big in Europe. Some chefs cut the lobster in half before cooking. Others like to tear off the claws and tail and toss only those parts into the pot. So it's like, yeah, okay, there might be some marginally more humane ways of doing it, but there's also much more horrific ways of doing it as well, just cutting them in half, poking holes in their fucking skeleton and microwaving them. Terrible stuff. Here, take a little tea break. I'll just look at the chat. Yeah, the microwave is gnarly. Holy fart indeed, Poopsie Tutor. Holy fart indeed. And then even worse than this too, he's like, lobsters, again, coming to the biology, they don't have much by way of eyesight or hearing, but they do have an exquisite tactile sense. And he says scientists, studies have found that even like a 1 degree change in temperature is enough for lobsters to notice. And so it's just like, there are kind of like these quote unquote dumb creatures, and they don't have like these brains, they're blind, they're deaf, whatever. But if they got one thing going for them, they're really great tactile sense, which of course makes something being like boiled alive, perhaps, who knows how much infinitely more excruciating, like we kind of talked about. We'd have no access to what it's like to be this lobster, so it could just be like, God knows, some ungodly amount of pain, but again, we'll never know. And then, okay, yeah, so just moving on here. So, and he talks about all these different things, and again, lobsters have neurotransmitters associated with when the brain registers pain and this, that, and the other. And so after kind of addressing all these things, he says, still after all the abstract intellectualization, there remains the fact that of the frantically clanking lid, the pathetic clinging to the edge of the pot, standing at the stove, it is hard to deny in any meaningful way that this is a living creature experiencing pain and wishing to avoid and escape the painful experience. And, actually, I really like this part. It's just a sobering, because he gets so down into the nitty gritty of the argument, and it's like, okay, well, some people think this with the biology, some people think that, back and forth. But at the end of the day, after all this abstract intellectualization, goodness, at the end of the day, you're sitting at the pot, the thing's boiling, and it's scrambling to get out. At the end of the day, it seems, as he says, that this is a living creature experiencing pain and wishing to avoid and escape the painful experience. And so, yeah, and it's difficult not to sense that they're unhappy or frightened, even if it's some rudimentary version of these feelings, even if they're not cognitively, like, even if they don't have intelligence or any of these higher order cognitive forms, you know, even if it's at its most rudimentary version, this is some fucked up shit. And as he says, if you begin to think about it this way, the MLF, the festival, begins to take on the aspect of something like a Roman circus or medieval torture fest. Is it possible that future generations will regard our present agribusiness and eating practices in much the same way we now view Nero's entertainment or Mengelé's experiments? My own initial reaction is that such a comparison is hysterical, extreme, and yet the reason it seems extreme is because I apparently believe that animals are less morally important than human beings. So again, interesting stuff here. He's talking about, like, when we will is the equivalent of when we look back and see all these horrific practices, is that what people will think of us? And then David Foster Wallace is doing a sort of dissection of his own moral beliefs. He's like, frankly, I don't think it's going to be that bad. But then when I think about why wouldn't it be that bad, he comes to the conclusion, well, it must be just because I consider animals that are not humans to be less important than humans. And then he also sort of calls that into question. Why? Why do I think an animal, even if they are, you know, less cognitively intelligent or anything like that, even if it's in its rudimentary forms, is it really that much lower that we can justify, you know, all these things that are going on? And so, kind of, I think, yeah, wrapping up here to the close, he says, for those gourmet readers who enjoy, and again, this is a direct, you know, call to action for the people, for the gourmet readers themselves. For those gourmet readers who enjoy well-prepared and presented meals involving beef, veal, lamb, pork, chicken, lobster, etc., do you think much about the possible moral status and probable suffering of the animals involved? If you do, what ethical convictions have you worked out that permit you not just to eat, but to savor and enjoy flesh-based viands? What makes it feel truly okay inside to just, because he says, you know, for some people who kind of like write this off, he says, what makes it feel truly okay inside to just dismiss the whole thing out of hand? That is your refusal to think about any of this the product of actual thought? Or is it just that you don't want to think about it? And if the latter, then why not? Do you ever think even idly about the possible reasons for your reluctance to think about it? I'm not trying to bait anyone here. I'm genuinely curious. After all, isn't being extra aware and attentive and thoughtful about one's food and its overall context part of what distinguishes a real gourmet? And so this part I think is just fantastic. He's calling people out essentially. You know, for one, have you given this any thought? You know, like genuinely, have you given this thought? If not, why? Like, what makes you think it's okay to just write it off? And if you do think it's okay to write it off, you know, why do you think that? You know, taking this several different levels. And also, you know, again, as we've talked about throughout this thing, kind of interrogating his own beliefs about this. And, you know, brings it full circle back to the gourmet. Isn't the point of what a gourmet is, because that is the magazine, that is the target audience, the kind of philosophy underlying the magazine that he's, you know, doing this correspondence for, isn't the point to be extra aware and attentive and thoughtful about one's food? So, and you know, that's just facts. So, okay, I see a little bit of chat. He's maybe saying, if the lobster could talk like I can, would you identify with the lobster? Yeah, oh, okay. It's very funny when he says, I'm curious about whether a reader can identify with any of these reactions and discomforts. Yeah. Also, if killing a lobster is okay because it's basically a bug, why is it okay to kill a bug? L. Yeah, I mean, that's also interesting. Like, if we are okay with killing bugs, I think people do that without a second's thought. You know, and these are these sea insects, yeah, that's a great point. I mean, part of it might be, well, okay, so let's take that somewhere, because I think part of it is the, like, torturous nature of, like, you know, they're being boiled alive or they're being poked up and microwaved. And, you know, I don't know, personally, I guess if you just squash a bug, it's like, okay, it's not that bad. But, you know, when you hear about people, you know, like ripping the legs off of bugs or, you know, magnifying glass, burning them alive, that shit is, you know, that's also kind of fucked up. Which also just tests our intuitions. I mean, maybe people feel differently about this, but if you do get a little squeamish at the thought of just like ripping bugs legs apart, you know, what that reveals something about yourself, right? Like if you feel uncomfortable with that, it's because, you know, maybe there is a little something going on there. And, you know, again, he talks about the hierarchy. At what level do we draw the line? You know, bugs, or even something like worms. In fact, he has a whole little passage here. Worms don't seem to have what he calls like a preference. You can cut them in half and they just go about their own thing. And it doesn't seem particularly as if, you know, they would have had it have been otherwise. Whereas something like a lobster seems to have, you know, more intelligence, more complexity. It clearly does not want to be boiled alive at that moment. So, yeah, interesting stuff. And then he wraps it up with just, you know, full circle. These questions that he's just talking about, these questions lead straight away into such deep and treacherous waters that it's probably best to stop the public discussion right here. There are limits to what even interested persons can ask of each other. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Consider the Lobster. I think it was just, you know, a fantastic essay. I mean, there's so many interesting things here. I mean, there's the meta level of the gonzo journalism. Again, him integrating his own experiences, which I've passed through, you know, a lot of that. That does make up a good you know, portion of this essay. And to me, the gonzo journalism is almost like a blend of like reporting, just like straight raw journalistic reporting, plus personal essay. You know, the parts where he's talking about the philosophy of the lobster and animal consciousness and sentience. That's something you would read in like a personal philosophical essay, but also the reporting about the event and the parades and the atmosphere and the vibe of everything. That is very much, I think, you know, like the pure journalistic state. And so when you combine them, it makes for the fantastic genre, which is gonzo journalism. So let's see. I think it's typical of DFW to not give any strong moral convictions at the end of his essays, and I feel like he does that here. You mean like keeps it ambiguous? Because that's how I understood it. You know, throughout this whole thing, he's like, you know, we can never know. He even prefaces the whole, you know, where he goes off. He's like, let's just acknowledge first off that these involve hardcore metaphysics, epistemology, value theory, ethics. You know, this is some very deep philosophical water we're in. And I agree. I mean, if you were saying, is he keeping it ambiguous here? It seems like he's asking himself these questions as well, you know. And as he has shown before, he's been interrogating. He's like, you know, as for me, half of this crap I didn't even know with the factory farming. And he talks about like this truly horrific video from PETA that they've published, and I think I know the video he's talking about. I don't have the guts to watch it, but I remember my one of my older friends, he was showing me a video that I think was about that, the one narrated by Alec Baldwin, and that video alone made him go vegetarian for life. And he's like, you know, this is shit I hadn't thought about. I hadn't seen that PETA video. I hadn't been, you know, I wasn't aware of debeaking and cutting off the tails of pigs. So it's almost like this essay was him also learning and in turn probing philosophically like the implications of everything that he's learning about. And of course, all of this comes from the precedent of the Lobster Festival, right? He's just going to report and then back he comes with this crazy ass essay. So, yeah, the brutality aspect changes the outlook on killing anything for food or otherwise. Yeah, I mean, I agree totally. Interesting S2W. Oh, good hat. Yep. It's more like, do you think about this? Why or why not? Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to reread it because it hits so hard. What makes it feel truly okay inside to just dismiss the whole thing out of hand? That is your refusal to think about any of this the product of actual thought, or is it just that you don't want to think about it? Because he says, you know, my philosophy on this was just not to think about it at all. And so, again, in a way, he's also probing himself, but of course, the gourmet reader. You don't think about this. Why? Is it because you've thought about it and you've decided it's not worth thinking about, or have you just decided not to think about it at all? If the latter, why not? Do you ever think even idly about the possible reasons for your reluctance to think about it? So he's like, if you don't think about it, what are your reasons for not thinking about it? Bro's just, you know, cutting straight to the source. So yeah, and let's see. It's more like, do you think about any of this? Why or why not? Yeah. To me, it felt like he was about to go in right at the end. I think it perhaps points to the fact that you have to go so far into the deep end and tread unclear gray areas to discuss animal cruelty in relation to the need for sustenance. It is actually very difficult to understand and talk about. Yeah, I mean, animal consciousness is one of those fields that is just absolutely wrought with like arguments and objections, and you'll find every position under the sun with animal consciousness. There's the full behaviorists. They don't feel anything. Humans are the only ones that have, some level of consciousness and capacity of suffering. And then, of course, there's the other end, which is like, all life. Even people would say, I bet there's some people out there who think stuff like this applies to even stuff like plants and the lower animals and things like that. And then there's, I think it's Jeremy Bentham. His whole thing is like intelligence complexity, intelligence, none of that crap matters at all. The only thing that matters is, do they feel pain or do they not feel pain? That is the central question. So there's so many different ways people think about, the animal consciousness stuff. So yeah, it's like he outlines the possible directions that you can go when thinking about eating lobster and leaves you. Yeah, I know. Bro just hits you with an existential crisis and then says, all right, peace, gourmet. I think he tends to think that question of this caliber is so complex that you could think about it for lifetimes and not have certain issues. Yeah, I agree, except, what comes to mind for me is, at the end of the day, it demands an answer, right? These extremely philosophical questions are, they're in some ways impossible to answer. But at the end of the day, we all do have to make our own individual choice. If not with lobsters, then with this higher stuff that he's been bringing about, like with, eating meat. And some people choose, like whoever was in the chat, like to go vegan. And some people find other sorts of, middle ground compromises. And then some people just don't think about it at all. But I think you cannot read this essay without questioning your own relationship with essentially just eating other animals. I think that's actually what it comes down to. And, the moral calculus of, is an animal suffering, what level of that meets the threshold for our own, as he says, gustatory pleasure. And of course, it's deeper than that, because it's like, it's our sustenance, right? Like, it's actually, we do need that stuff. It's not just purely pleasure. But yeah, there's, tons of good stuff there. Like maybe if he didn't have a deadline, CTL would be 500 pages. Wait, what's CTL? Oh, okay, yeah, I see. I said CTL, huh? But yeah, do you think about this or not? Pay attention to that, and there's only so much we can ask of each other. Yeah. So, but I don't know. I'm curious. I think I've kind of got a feel from, what the chat's been saying, but, any last final thoughts on Consider the Lobster? I think it's a, great essay, fantastic. And, one of those that is genuinely philosophical. And I feel like it's a rare thing, and it should be less rare, but especially when it's paired in like, a classic, what you would think would be a conventional classic reporting on, a touristy lobster festival. He takes that experience, weaves his own interactions and experiences during that time, and then hits you with like a philosophical bombshell. So, I love whatever that genre is, the gonzo journalism, I fuck with it. Our desires and capitalism, including the part of capitalism that gives him a limit on how much he can write, i.e. the deadline, reduce our capacity to think about whether what we do is okay. Yeah, right. So I think you're saying the idea is like, desire and capitalism are part of that framework that you say reduce our capacity to think about whatever. I mean, even just like with the capitalism stuff and factory farming, that whole thing is, I think, very deliberately meant to put all that stuff behind the curtains. Because if we knew what was going on behind factory farming, even if it was the most humane circumstance, the most humane conditions you could imagine, any level, if you just had to do the actual killing of the animal itself, that totally changes your perspective. And I mean, that's like stuff with like the Native American culture, right? And I mean, not just them, but they do have a particularly special relationship with the animal that they killed. Like when they kill the animal, they thank it. And they give offerings to, like, the buffalo god or the deer god, like, whatever the... There is a spiritual relationship taking place that's not just, like Good had mentioned, this capitalist, right, factory farming. Like, we just breed animals to bring them up as quick as possible, kill them with these machines, totally behind closed doors. They come to us nice, neat, packaged, and, there's no fur, there's no blood, and then if you do capture a little, like, vein or a little feather, that disgusts you. Like, I don't know about you guys, but that anytime that happens, I'm like, that's fucking nasty. But so we get all that pure, like, clearly packaged and clean for us, because otherwise we'll think about it, right? You said, Good Hat, it reduces our capacity to think about whether what we do is okay. My interpretation, or like, my response to that is, this is an example of where they do that. They reduce your ability to think about it because they just, give it to you prepackaged. Like, you don't even, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but unless I really think about it, you know, a piece of chicken, a piece of beef, I don't associate an ant, like, you know, an actual chicken or a cow with that. You know, certainly not, you know, pork or with pigs or anything as well. Very good essay. I like that it steps outside norms, and honestly, I wish it was more writing was like that. Yeah, instead of it all being so sterile, it's a great essay. Yeah, that's my thing with this journalistic stuff. I think this is just better for everybody, but it's a little, it's what's the word? Like, not revolutionary, not countercultural, but it's unconventional. You know, people don't like. I bet there's a lot of gourmet readers who felt a little uneasy about this and probably wrote letters to the editor saying, you know, what the fuck was that essay? So I think there's a lot of people who, you know, maybe in some ways don't want that. They want the clear, polished, here are the simple facts, here is the simple reporting. I'm not going to give any, because, you know, when you think about it, journalism is supposed to be, you know, the core principle of, you know, like, for instance, something like political journalism is objectivity. All right, the subjective is never supposed to touch the journalistic, at least, again, in something like politics or reporting about facts and history. But there is clearly a space where you can do a little bit of both. I'd find eating meat more conscionable if the animal actually had a life aside from it being eaten in the future. I agree, Cool Colt, and I don't know if this is just, you know, cope, but, like, ideally for me, the animals got all this free space. They get to live out most of their life, and then just in a real quick way, they're killed. But I mean, even saying that, me saying that out loud, like, I don't. It's still kind of that same principle. You're still farming an animal. Obviously, Cool Colt, and I totally agree. If they have a humane life, it's almost like you just putting them out of their misery real quick, and they were able to have a full, rich experience with all the normal good stuff, and then we get our meat on top of that. But then there's also the almost basically logistic element where it's like, you know, cows' meat is best and most tender at a certain age, and I think it tends to be pretty young. Same thing with, like, chickens. And if you really, try telling capitalism to give each of these animals their own life and let them have pastures and let them, you know, that's what's not happening. Capitalism is built. I mean, factory farming is inevitable, logical conclusion of capitalism. Like, the life of the animal is the least important thing. It's all about just farming, you know, literally farming the meat. It starts funny and then goes deeper and deeper into the brutality of a seemingly pedestrian aspect of our everyday life, and then ends on a kind of somber, sober note. It is like, now you have to go live with this. Yeah, good. I think that's perfect. The beginning of the book is just describing, you know, you got these, like, cheesy pageants going on, and there's people, the masticatory noses, and they're chewing, and, you know, kids of various fine motor development, and, you know, the whole thing's just kind of goofy, lighthearted, and we're getting our introduction to and, you know, then he really does do a good job of gradually, you're right, kind of weaving you. It goes more and more somber and sober. You know, you learn about the lobster as a biological aspect, and then of course the whole passage where he's talking about actually boiling the lobster alive, and then the philosophical implications. So I agree, it hooks you with that, like, little, hey, look, journalistic lobster festival, it's hot, it's sweaty, this shit sucks. And then it's like, with also little philosophical, like, really interesting fragments. You know, he, like, the tourist is economically significant but existentially loathsome. You get little beauties like that sprinkled throughout, but then it continues to escalate into what ends with just like really a philosophical call to action to at least think about what you are actually doing when you're eating animals, which, of course, isn't that the point of being a gourmet? Huge separation between the animal slaughtering and neat packaged meat, yes. Emotional arc of the essay is cool, and it's almost cinematic. Yeah, yep, totally agree. DFW kind of leads you smoothly into the deeper thoughts. And I think that's, I mean, from what I've read, that's a lot about what his essays kind of do. And this is just a really penetrating one that gets at all that. So, yeah, I thought fantastic essay. Everything I read by him is great, but this, of course, is, like, you know, the classic thing to read by him. So, yeah, I mean, I guess unless there's any final thoughts, we can kind of start wrapping up. But I thought this was fun. I enjoyed this. I kind of plan to do this. I'm planning to do it like weekly, so we'll see how that goes. But for anyone that is interested and wants to, tune along, I'm thinking someone suggested it in the Discord. We are going to do the Circular Ruins by Borges. I wanted to reread it before I officially picked that, but I think that's going to be. I think there's going to be a lot of good stuff in that short story. And Borges also has a very maximalist style, which I think pairs very nicely with like David Foster Wallace. he's also, of course, very philosophical and everything. So I think for next week, we're going to be talking about The Circular Ruins by Jorge Luis Borges. I'll post a link in the Discord. I'm sure it's online somewhere. And then let's just check the chat here. Very good essay. Always love to read DFW. Yep. Have you read Elizabeth Costello by Coetzee? It's a novel about factory farming and meat eating partly. I read it for a philosophy class. I like how it talks about it being an unconscious moral burden on society. No, I have not read that. So it's called Elizabeth Costello. No, I've not heard about that, but that sounds really interesting. I like the idea of the unconscious moral burden on society, because if you want to take a psychoanalytic perspective on this, there's no way around. I mean, we're even kind of assuming, I think most people here have a consensus, even something as low on the hierarchy of animals feels pain. And when you think about, not horses, cows and pigs and chickens, it's clear that they've got to have some level of something going on. So if you view this psychoanalytically, and like you said, Poopsie Tudor, about it being an unconscious moral burden to society, it's like we are doing, psychoanalysis preaches of the idea of repression, where things that you do that are immoral or that you're ashamed of, these are things that you sweep under the rug of the mind, right? You put it away. In our own lives, there's certain memories, certain things we're doing, certain thoughts that when they pop up, we are essentially ashamed of them, and you repress them. And, that's all fine and well, but if you have too much repressed contents, if you do too much repression, just as if you plug a pipe, which is letting water out, the pressure builds and builds until eventually it bursts, right? That's like where you get all these, that's essentially the psychoanalytic reason for why mental disorders exist in different forms of neuroticism, is that the repressed contents find new forms in like these mental disorders. But anyway, bringing that back to, if we look at it as a collective, what we are doing to animals is, downright torture, essentially. It's as horrific as you can possibly get. And again, all of us sweep it under the rug of our minds, right? It all takes place behind the closed door of factory farming. To us, it just comes on this nice packaged meat. But when, if you think about it collectively, there is still a societal burden, right? That unconscious repression, which is going to find new ways of coming out if left unaddressed for too long. Because I think at the back of everybody's mind, I'd be curious, an essay like this really brings to the forefront what's going on. But I do think at some level, people, even if, again, at that kind of unconscious level, have to know this came from an animal, this came from a cow. I've seen videos of cows. I see cows walking along when I'm driving and I see cows, I see them on the road. They're so cute. I love them. And yet, there's some understanding that they are being slaughtered en masse. And so, again, if you view that in terms of the repression, yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I'll have to check that out. Okay, just catching up on chat here. I've heard Coetzee's good too, yeah. DFW has this tendency that he exhibits in his essay where he asks a question and then is like, is that a dumbass question to ask? In a sense, he's really doubtful of his mind. It's all over his writing and his interviews, and especially certain essays in this collection. Yeah, good hat. I don't know if you made it to the interview that we just did the last stream on, but yeah, he kept constantly asking, like, does that make sense? Like, is this making any sense? You're right. So he does seem a little, like you say, maybe not self-conscious, but yeah, doubtful of his mind, which is ironic because it's clearly hitting hard for all of us in these generations to come. So yeah, okay. Anyway, lots of good stuff. I think that might be more or less the wrap up. Again, we're reading Circular Ruins for next week. And overall, fantastic essay, tons of great ideas. The writing itself was really fun, too. That's something about David Foster Wallace. I personally really enjoy the footnote dynamic, too, where you're bouncing back and forth between these huge passages. And it's just a very chaotic sort of, and I think, again, the festival atmosphere fits this really well itself. But the whole thing is chaotic. It's maximalist. The whole thing is David Foster Wallace. So... all right, on that note, yes, thank you, Good Hat. I've had a great time with this stream. I hope you guys got something out of it, have fun. Like I said, I'm planning on doing this, I think, on a weekly basis. I think this could be a really cool format, especially as, chat continues to grow and stuff like that. And yeah, like you said, thank you, Defunct Fire Discussion. And I agree, we do got to crack open Borges, who I think, again, will be a good companion piece to this. All right, thank you guys, everyone, so much. I appreciate all the love, and I'll see you guys on the next video, or at the very least next week. Thank you guys for watching. Big Nate's Reading Club, home of the best reading clubs. Bye.